Let's talk about working with layered files inside Fusion in DaVinci Resolve. When you work with multi-layered Photoshop documents, or if you have multi-layer EXR render files for CG artists, in both cases we can access those layers from Fusion. We could always do that. Now starting from DaVinci Resolve 20, we can access those layers directly within each tool in the tool chain, so we can use arbitrary layers throughout our compositing chain and access them in different ways from our tools, as well as access them directly from the viewer. So I want to show you what is this about and how I might use this in this tutorial for anybody working with Photoshop layers or CG renders. Let's have a look. Let me start with the Photoshop file. There I can illustrate most of the concepts and ideas, and at the end I'll show you how I might use this on a CG render. Some additional tips at the end for that. So let's start by bringing in a PSD document. This doesn't have to come from Photoshop. GIMP can create PSD files. I think Affinity can. Multiple software solutions can create PSD files. If you drag it in either from the media pool or directly from your file system, you can just drag and drop it into the flow. You get access to layers. That's not new. You can access them here. So by default, you get the merged one, the combined one, or you can access individual elements if you just need one element. You can do this in the media in node or in a Fusion loader node if you use either loader nodes for EXR files or in Fusion Studio. So this works fine. Now what is new is that we can also access this directly in the viewer. So we can preview individual layers. And we can just switch here. Now, this does not change what we are doing in processing, and this could potentially confuse us, right? So we could look at the screenshot here, and then maybe we add some color operation or whatever. This one still works on the main layer, on the first layer. And the output is still the default layer, and what we are seeing here is just something different. We're just using the viewer to quickly check another layer. However, we can now use any of those nodes to switch what they are working on. So this brightness and contrast, right now it's working on the default layer as the process layer, and it uses input and effect is set to auto, which will also then be this default layer. But we can switch it, for example, to all layers, and now you see that other layers that are not being used at the end are being manipulated as well. Not being used, this layer is technically not used here because Photoshop gives us a merged layer which contains everything, and that's the one we see at the end. And this contains everything the way that Photoshop combines things. Usually it's the same as if you manually merged all those layers together. However, not always, because sometimes there are translation errors. For example, here I have intentionally included one. So for example, this layer icon here, you see it's much darker here. And let me remove the brightness and contrast so we don't worry about that. This layer icon here is darker than the equivalent icon in the final default or merged layer, which is the same. And the reason is, if I show you in Photoshop, is that I used an adjustment layer here, and adjustment layers don't translate through the export and import into Fusion. So what I should have done is I should have applied this first and applied it into the layer. Should make sure everything here is rasterized, all masks are being applied, then you are probably in a good shape. Otherwise, if you have adjustments layers or vector layers or stuff like that, or external masks, things can sometimes go wrong. So that's just something to keep in mind why it's good that we have the merged one and the individual layers. Now let's say we want to pull one element out. Let's say we want to take the Resolve logo out and do something different with this. If we just want to pull one element, well, we can of course change it here, as I showed you before, or we could use, for example, a transform or whatever operation we might want to use anyways. And in this, just change the input layer here now and just set this to the DaVinci Resolve logo. And at the same time, we can transform. And this one, the output of that transform, the output goes back to the default layer, which is called the process layer here. So we are kind of piping the input from a different layer into the transform, and we could send this one to the media out or work with it in any way, right? So we have pulled out a layer and brought it into our default layer. This again can be confusing because in the flow you hardly see that something like this might be going on. You do see this little indicator here on the side which shows that there are layers. If I reset the input layer, you see this icon is going away. So this is how you can see this. Now, how could we practically apply it? Let's first do something quick and dirty besides pulling out elements, which we could also do by copying the media in and changing it here, right? But what we could do in the flow, we could quickly grab a mask, for example, for some quick and dirty adjustments. Let's say I want to change the appearance of the number 20 here, for example. What I could do is I could use a color corrector and attach the same input also to the mask input. And now in the settings, I just say what the mask should be, and the mask should be the text number 20. And now I have an option to run an effect on this. Let me bring it into the viewer. Run an effect, in this case, a hue change, based on the mask that is being used from a different layer. And again, you see this little layer symbol on the side to indicate that that's what's going on here. Now, working with masks can be tricky. For some effects, that's fine. For color corrections, sometimes you get edge artifacts and semi-transparent edge pixels. It would probably be better to work on the element individually and then composite it again at the end. The same, or even more so important, if you want to start animating elements, if you want to fly in elements, this approach won't work, right? You can't just mask a transform in order to fly an element in, for example. Instead, we really need access to all the individual elements. Traditionally, what you would do is just use the Fusion import feature for the Photoshop document. Use your Photoshop file here, and after import, Fusion automatically imports all the layers from Photoshop here in the left viewer once I set the left viewer again to default. And you see I have everything in the default layer as individual media in nodes, and these are the ones that are called normal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They are all merge nodes, and it says normal because we're using the apply mode normal. It does support different Photoshop blend modes, which then would be written into the merge nodes so that you can see what is being used. But we are just building up the composite like this. Now, this is the traditional approach, and I think this still is valid and makes sense in many places. If I simply want to grab one element or add a few transforms or so to animate something, let's say I want the word DaVinci Resolve to fly in, I would probably simply put a transform after that word DaVinci Resolve, right, and animate this for my fly in. Let's do something basic. Oops, I didn't use the word DaVinci Resolve, but the icon, where is it? Text DaVinci Resolve. Here it is. That's what I wanted to do, right? So I can directly go into the individual line for each element and add whatever animations I want to do. Now, in this new approach, what I could do, let me copy this transform. I could bring this transform in here and say this transform should work not on all layers, but it should work on the text DaVinci Resolve. And let me see in the left viewer, if I set this to text DaVinci Resolve, you see that this layer is being manipulated. Now I just have to do this compositing that the import did automatically for me. I have to manually do this before the media out. Here is how I would do this. For many elements, I would not use merges anymore. I might use the multi-merge, which could be an easier way to set this up. And let me connect this to the media out. My preference, I would probably merge everything over a blank background. And I show you why. So this is like a dummy background. And the reason why is because now I can have all my layers in my layer list here, and I can set them up one by one. So I can bring this in. It will always take the name from the previous tool, but I can use this first one here for the background and name this background. And then I can connect the same again into the multi-merge. And it's convenient to have this layer access like directly on the same page. So here I don't have to switch between settings and merge. In the multi-merge, I have this direct access, which is, yeah, definitely convenient. and I can rename, and at the end I have all my layers here. Let me quickly do this before we continue the tutorial. Now I have recomposited all my layers through this multi-merge over this dummy background, and I see all my layers here. I can turn them on and off, including the background, right? That's why I've set it up this way, and can check that I'm indeed taking the respective layer here. I would probably make this a bit more compact. I can do an Alt or Option left click here to add a pipe router, so I can set this up like this. And now I can do all my adjustments here. You already see I've done one adjustment already, and those are now pretty flexible. Let's say I don't want to only include the text, but I want to include the text and the number 20. So I can go into my transform, and in the process layers, I could also choose the number 20, right? Or even better, I can go to custom, and I can choose to do this on number 20 and on the word DaVinci Resolve. And this way I have used the same transform and immediately applied it to two layers at the same time. I might do a color correction now for this element, which is too dark. It was brighter in my Photoshop layer, right? So I might add brightness and contrast. And this one I process only on the layer icon, where I can now do a gamma change. The only thing, for every operation that I do now, I have to make sure that I choose the correct layer, because I'm no longer using that merged layer that we had before. So if you now add any other operation here and don't change the layer, this operation will simply do nothing. Right? So this is something you have to pay attention. If you do this approach, you have to be sure that always you choose the correct layers for every operation. But you can have a very compact overview of your animations, apply them to as many layers as you want with a single node, which has an advantage over this approach if you do it a lot. If you just do one or two animations, this is probably easier. If you have a lot and you have a lot that is applied to multiple layers, then I think this can be the cleaner approach. At the moment, this requires some manual setup. I hope that perhaps in the future, maybe we get some import feature like what we had here that does the same with the multi-merge, or perhaps we could build some script for this. I think I'm waiting for if Blackmagic Design will still add something here before I do work on my own, but it would definitely be possible to script this setup so that it doesn't have to be done manually. But let's see what Blackmagic Design will do in the next updates. I am on the first beta release of Resolve 20, so perhaps we still get some improvements for this or a similar kind of setup. I think this illustrates already nicely what we can do here. Let me now use a CG render import. I'm using the same features. I just want to share some additional ideas how working with layers can help us and how it looks like if you have like technical render passes, etc. So I have here my famous coffee maker that I used before, and this time I added a lot of passes. So on the one hand, we have two layers. So we have the foreground layer and a background layer separately, and I did not render out a combined one. Right, so I do have to do something to combine background and foreground again, these two render layers. That's one thing. By the way, this is all in linear. Let me turn on my view LUT here. That's one thing, but I also have now access to different color passes, like diffuse color alone, and then the different direct, indirect lighting passes, and some gloss pass, and so on. And also technical passes, which also appear here. For example, we can look at a normal pass. Normally, that normal pass would not be used as a layer, but would appear here as an additional channel. And we would usually set this up in the media in node. So we would choose a layer here. So let's say we choose the espresso machine combined, and we go into the EXR settings and, for example, set up a depth pass or normal pass. Let me use the depth one, so I only have to set up one position depth. Here it is. Right? So you can select them, and it's always annoying for if you have multiple normal passes or position passes or so, you have to click around a lot and you set this up. But now I have set this up for one layer, and now this is appearing as a Z channel here. right? So this is how we have used this before. Now you can also use it through layers, which means you don't necessarily have to set it up. If you just want to use your Z channel as a mask, feed it into some effect, you could do it the same way I showed you earlier. Just pull it out and in the respective node select the layer where you want to use that. If you need to recombine things like recombine foreground and background, you can do it the same way I did here with a multi-merge or just a simple merge and just merge the layers together again. We have those settings here that you've seen now in pretty much every node. Every node that has inputs and effect layers and so on has that option now. So that means if you need a channel boolean to multiply some layers together or subtract something or so, again, you can still do this. However, this is getting a bit annoying with the technical passes, because if you set up technical passes here, if you want to set them up this way, because some tools can use them directly if they are listed in this, right? Like a depth blur, for example, would take the Z pass directly from here, not from a different layer. So if I set this up like this, but now I use, say, a merge and I attach it to foreground and background, but now I switch the background to the actual background layer. Now I do combine this correctly, but I am losing my Z channel. So this combining here, these layers that you have here, they can contain arbitrary layers, but they are not linked to the channels here. So you are not able to do both. You're not able to set up all the channels, but then switch the layer. Because you can set this up only one time as for one media in node based on the layer chosen in that media in node. So that's a bit of a restriction here. So in this case, if I wanted both Z channels, I would probably still make a copy here and set one to the espresso machine, one to the background, and not use the layer approach in this way. However, let's ignore this example for a second. In other cases, if you have your final output, or you just want to access technical passes for some specific purpose, I think this layer approach is still very useful. Let's say we want to use this direct gloss paths here and modify like how shiny this object appears. So this would be similar to the color correction I showed you earlier. So I might add a simple brightness and contrast and then add this back in, or I might get myself another node. Let's take a bitmap node, for example. Bitmap to pull out that one pass from where I am at the moment. So here I can pull out from the image layer, from the background, I can pull out that direct gloss pass, and in the controls, I can set this to luminance. So I want to use all the color channels, like the intensity of the gloss here, and can directly manipulate this. So to focus, for example, on some areas, perhaps add a bit of softness to it, and then attach this into my brightness and contrast. The gain, let me bring this into the viewer and reduce the gain a tiny bit. And if you look at, for example, in this area, you see I can use this to selectively work on how glossy or how shiny this object appears. And I've done that by at any point in the flow by pulling out one layer, manipulating it a bit through my bitmap node, manipulating the mask a little bit. And I don't need to have multiple media ins and for every layer. So I can do this anywhere in a larger flow, pull it out, combine it again, manipulate it, continue with my default layer. All right, I hope this gave you some good ideas how you can use this layer system, starting with DaVinci Resolve 20, currently in beta. We'll see. At the moment I cannot create arbitrary layers in Fusion myself. I would wish for some tools to more easily move layers around. You can do everything with merges and channel booleans and so on, but there are a few things which don't work that smoothly, or the setup of recombining all the layers that are there, like what I did with the Photoshop document. Those are things that I think over time we'll see what tools we get or what tools we build ourselves, and how we want to approach this. I would say that this newer way of working with layers has its place, but it's probably not something I will use every time for everything, because in many cases you just have a few layers that you manually combine and can have that in the flow and visible in the flow. I think one disadvantage here is that we don't see it in the flow, which is also its advantage, because if we do have 100 layers, we may not want to see them all in the flow. So I do see the use cases, and I think everyone has to figure out, depending on your projects, where you want to bring this in and where you will keep working the way you have done it before in Fusion. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Let me know if you need more and what you need. And otherwise, thanks for watching. Take care. Cheers.